Hey everybody, we're talking to Dr. Michael Sosteric about mysticism, and this is Talk Gnosis. Hello, Dr. Sosteric.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm good. I generally just dive right in. Our guests are amazing. I rarely tell people who they are or give them a bio, but Dr. Sosteric, we're going to link a bunch of your work in the show notes. We're going to link your faculty page so people know who you are, where they can find you, where they can take courses from you, where they can read your work, because I think that everybody should. I say that
Oh,
every episode, but we only book the best.
okay. Well, I'll consider myself in good company.
Exactly. So I want to, just kind of dive right in and dive into, some of the issues that you've raised in your work, right? And
Yeah.
you write about your transformation from a materialist sociologist to quote unquote a professional mystic. You describe a terrifying experience where you had a confrontation with God, a God, maybe specifically the Catholic God of your youth. Could you elaborate on the specific fears that came up from this experience, the fear that you felt during this experience, uh, and how this confrontation paradoxically opened the door to such a profound spiritual awakening. How you worked through, or even as you put it, there's clearing experiences. There was something to do with that fear afterwards as the years went by. So if you can talk to us all about that.
Yeah. Well, I think the fears are fairly basic and probably understood by a lot of people who were raised Catholic. I was raised Catholic. Um, and so fears of unworthiness, fears of judgment, really visceral fears of eternal and fiery damnation. It sounds kind of crazy to be saying it in these modern times, but I had these sets of fears. They were installed, I guess, um, as a child, and they kind of remained dormant. I would have said up until my what I'd call a clearing experience, a mystical experience that cleared these fears. Um, I would have considered them non-existent. I grew up Catholic, but I entered university in psychology and then sociology, and I read Marx and religion bad. It's all superstitions. It's just rejected it all. So to have these things come up in a mystical experience uh, was a little disconcerting. Um, it, uh, it kind of forced me to reevaluate what I thought about the nature of consciousness and the nature of existence, I guess. Um, yeah, I didn't understand why. What happened after the experience was I just began this effusive mystical spew. It was just like writing and writing and writing and writing, and it was it was it was poems, and it was parables, allegories, and it was treatises on consciousness, and just a bunch of just stuff came just spewing out over the course of the next year. Um, and so, as I kind of reflected on all this and the initial fears, I started to conceptualize this as a clearing experience, and I started to think of consciousness in layers and with potential blockages, fear being one of the principal blockages. And I just realized that after this event, and where these fears dissipated, um, and this effusive flow began, that it something had been cleared, and it was the fears that had been installed by, I'm going to say, Catholic indoctrination. And the experience yourself, if you're interested in it, I basically sat down one night in front of a movie with my spouse, and just this terrifying dialogue with God began, where I felt judged, and I felt like um, I was unworthy of all redemption, and I was gonna be thrown into the pits of hell for all eternity. And I'd had this fear before, multiple times growing up, and my response in the past had always been to kind of, put my tail between my legs and turn away and just kind of repress it and try and go back to normal. But this time I was fed up with it. I was tired of having this recurring experience. And so I basically just gave God, or what I felt was God at the time, the middle finger, gave it shit for having such a perverse, cruel universe, and said, do whatever you want. I'm done with you. So, and then I went to bed kind of upset and traumatized, woke up traumatized. And then a few days later, this spew started. So that, that's kind of the basics of it. Yeah.
I find it so fascinating, particularly your outside of your academic work, though, of course, in the article where you deeply go into this, right? It's the autoethnography. Did I say that right? Where you are exploring your personal story and your experiences with, of course, the academic tools of a sociologist, as well as bringing in, all this other context and info from sociology. Uh, I think your personal story would be surprising to a lot of people because the narrative would go something like I was an atheist or an agnostic, and I suddenly had a connection experience, a mystical experience, and I was floating on the clouds in heaven, and I had the beatific vision, and I was one with everything, and I realized I was a fool to be an atheist, and it was so beautiful and it was so lovely. That's the story that people both hear. It's the story they expect, and it's, I think, the story both maybe consciously, unconsciously, people of faith, agnostics, atheists. It's the story they want to hear. So I think it's very powerful, very interesting, and maybe says something about connection experiences in general. That the experience that you had was terrifying, was scary fear, and that makes me think a lot about Gnosticism, which often sort of has this reputation for being a downer, right? If there's a specific Gnostic experience, I think a lot of the first ones, the ones that put people on these paths, are quote unquote negative experiences, similar to what you experienced. I think as well, Dr. Sosteric, I think there's something to be said that scholars think the first book of the Bible written was Job, because you kind of had your own sort of Jobian experience watching this film, where you got to look into the face of God, or whatever you want to call it, and call him out on his BS. So yeah, I just oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's I didn't have any. I just want to say, years later, as I was reflecting on these experiences and doing the research, I started to call these negative experiences nadir experiences, to contrast them with zenith experiences, which are the ones that people talk about. I think if somebody has this really terrifying paranoid style of experience, there's a default. I ain't talking about that to anybody because they're going to think I'm crazy, and I had those fears at the beginning too, you know. So there is growing recognition in the literature that these nadir experiences do exist, the bad experiences exist, and that they don't necessarily have negative outcomes. That from these experiences, positive growth can occur.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons is because you can clear these fears. Others is you can process trauma, or clear misunderstandings. There's all sorts of reasons why these experiences are beneficial when they do occur, if handled correctly, right?
Yes, exactly, which I think is definitely something we're going to be talking later on. I think there's a number of your papers that I read. We'll link them all up, right? But especially where you kind of go into the taxonomy, where I think again what a lot of people would understand is this is something that can't be studied. It can't be logically understood. It can only be worked through in a miracle. We're dealing with perhaps divine contact. It's outside of our day-to-day realities and understandings, right? But as you said, and as we'll talk about it as we explore your work, there are ways to classify, understand, work through, and work with these experiences, because I think a lot of people out there can understand that having this quote unquote negative experience, this nadir experience. Jeez, I'm going to be saying the word experience a lot in this particular episode. But when they experience this nadir, right? The idea that then there's work to do, I think, might be foreign to people, because it is thought that this is a process that is not psychological, that is not rational. If you have a bad experience, and God, or the divine, or the all is going to re-enter your life to fix it for you. Like I don't think I'm talking out of my boot. I think this is what some people might be thinking out there.
I think so. I think there's this expectation too that these are, if you have this, and I did, following this, I did have these effusive conversations with God, where it's going to sound weird, but where we kind of discuss, the emanation of creation and the emergence of physical matter and life and all that stuff. But these this information often comes in metaphoric, symbolic, vision type balls of content. And, speaking about the work, one of the things you have to do is you have to unwrap all that content. You have to lay it out and explain it in linear linguistic terms. So people who haven't had those experiences, or even people who have had those experiences, can kind of understand. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I frankly haven't seen anybody, except maybe in the Upanishads, where that sort of effort has been put into it. A lot of people have these experiences and go, oh, I'm enlightened, it's great. I'm going to go back to my normal job and my normal life, and that's it. I don't have anything to do, maybe heal some childhood trauma, or, answered some of your questions, some of your big questions, and that's it. But it's a lot to process, and it takes time to process. And you have to have that time, and you have to have the training. I'm going to say that, some kind of, doesn't necessarily have to be academic training, but you have to be used to dealing with ideas and handling them. And you have to have the will to do it too, right? And after a negative nadir experience like that, like I did so many times before, I didn't want anything to do with it. It was just this time that the difference was, and the outcome of this connection event, which was this effusive flow, information that I had no like material ground for, started to flow. And it was that the guy said, okay, I got to kind of figure this out. And I made a very intentional decision to figure it out. And I was very privileged in having a job in a career that gave me the space that I needed to do that, because it took, I'm going to say, at least a decade before I started to feel confident that what I was saying, what I understood, was making sense. It took a lot of effort. And that's just the intellectual thing. There's also emotional work that goes on there, because, once you start to have these regular connection experiences, then you're dealing with, emotional repressions, and you're dealing with indoctrination, ideology, and all this other stuff that gets layered into this, and makes this whole thing a very, sometimes disconcerting and confusing process, when I don't really think it has to be. If you've got a proper framework, and if you got a proper understanding, a little bit of guidance, it's relatively straightforward. And it's a natural thing that we're capable of as human beings.
Yeah, I definitely want to launch into that maybe next, but I use the phrase connection experience, which is your more neutral alternative to mystical experience. I was wondering if you could tell us about this framework and how it bridges understanding between the diverse spiritual traditions, scientific inquiry, and esoteric studies.
So, I'm going to make sure I got my notes here. So one of the things that I noticed early on, well, not early on, I spent the first part of the process just spewing. I just wrote. I made a conscious decision not to look at the literature, not to look at Bibles or Qurans or anything. Just whatever was there, I just put it on the paper. After I was satisfied that it was mostly out, then I started to look around and do research. And one of the things that I noticed right away was that everybody's got a different word for this. Mystical experience, transcendent experience, flow experience. I've got a list of it on the Spirit Wiki. There's like dozens and dozens of terms from different esoteric and exoteric and scientific traditions. Everybody and their dog has a word for this experience. And so I called that nomenclature confusion, and said to myself, we need a term that can kind of bridge all this. Because everybody talks. A lot of people talk about it far more than I think we recognize. And when I was thinking about what happened to me in that original event and later on, I thought, well, I'm connecting with something. I'm connecting with something bigger than my normal day-to-day consciousness. I'm connecting with a knowledge source, or fabric, as I call it, that exists outside or inside me. And so connection, I think, covers the phenomenology of that. It does actually feel like a connection to something more, if you ask people, and it's sorry, I kind of losing my train of thought here. And it gives, I guess it gives us a term that atheists and materialists and spiritual people and everybody can kind of say, okay, I think this describes the phenomenology. That doesn't solve the problem, because of course the question becomes, what are you connecting to? And you're going to answer that differently depending on your background. So, a neuroscientist investigating mystical experience connection experience might say, well, there's stuff going on in the brain. You're connecting to unconscious aspects of your brain or lower centers or however they are explaining it. A Christian might say you're connecting with angels or Christ or God. There's examples in the literature of people having sexual experiences with Christ. They're connecting in that way. I'm not laughing because I think it's silly, just that
Oh,
it's a connection experience, right? It's just a different type of
I've seen that statue of Saint Teresa. I
yeah,
know what's going on there.
yeah, yeah. And a New Age person might say, well, you're connecting to the Pleiadian star cluster, whatever they say, right? Gnostics might say one thing. A Freemason will say you're connecting to the blazing star, that sort of thing. So it's connection kind of captures all those experiences and gives us a point to start, right? And then we can talk about what we're connecting to until we're blue in the face, but at least that gives us a way to say, yeah, all these experiences, we're all talking about kind of the same thing here, right? And it gives us the ability to start throwing our information together and analyzing and thinking critically and moving forward, because I think there's nomenclature confusion, and it doesn't just center around mystical experiences. There's other terms where it's also confused, where there's also that sort of confusion, has really kind of hampered our ability to understand, theorize, research this really important phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the times on this show, there's usually a very clear divide. Even if we have a scholar practitioner, we're usually only talk about one of those two sides, right? So we have shows that are very obviously, very blatantly from the inside, and then we have shows, quote unquote, from the outside with a scholar, right? So it's really great that we have you right now, but just in general that you're out here doing this work, since you can kind of shift between the two. But I wanted to clarify, kind of wrap up in a bow, what you were talking about. You mentioned that word phenomenology, right? So as a sociologist, as an academic, you can't discover with the tools of sociology if someone is actually talking to the Christian God or the Christian God is actually talking to them, right? But we can study, as you said, this phenomenon. Things are happening. They seem to be happening in clear stages in similar ways to people all around the world, in different contexts, different cultures, and different ages. But there seems to be enough similarity here with the experience of the connection experience, right? That we have data that we can look at with the academic and sociological tools that are available to us.
Yeah, I mean, definitely looking at it with sociological tools is important. Psychologists have looked at this, William James, philosophers have looked at this, Stace, um, and one or two sociologists have kind of nodded in the direction. I can think of one who took it kind of seriously, but he's not really important. He worked in the past. Sociologists in general not do not touch this with a 10-foot pole. They do not go near religion except to kind of say it's a community thing, like Durkheim said, it's a community thing, or it's an opiate or whatever. And they just kind of dismiss that everything there, including mystical experiences, irrelevant, not important, delusional. So I think it's kind of important to point out that we do need these sociological tools, because as a sociologist, there were certain things that I began to notice as I began to do the research, that only a sociologist would notice, um, and so it's important. And yes, we do need to use these sociology tools, and it's as I hope I probably demonstrated, I guess, if I'm talking to you, that it is an important approach to this, in addition to psychological approaches and historical approaches and religious approaches, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned both a little bit back and within one of your papers that the quote unquote mystical experiences, connection experiences, are more common than we're potentially led to believe. And so-called common sense, general public opinion would say that they're very rare, they're very personal, they only happen to very special people. Maybe it's a once in a lifetime, once in a million sort of thing. How what help me out here. How could such a thing be common? How can people be so wrong that this is such a rare thing? Can you tell me more about this connection experience as being this quote unquote, the common more happening more than maybe many realize?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I first started to, that's not really my insight. This is Abraham Maslow had this insight. So he studied peak experiences. He studied transcendent experiences. He studied plateau experiences. He had three terms to describe these connection experiences: peak, plateau, sorry. And he said, as he was researching and talking to people, that he began to realize that these experiences were a lot more common than people thought. And one of the problems in determining this was because everybody had a different language for it. Everybody, if you were walking out in nature and you were an atheist, you had a nature experience, which was an experience of oneness with nature. It was a very materialist atheist sort of experience. If you were a Christian out there walking in nature, you had a connection with God in those moments, depending on what you were open to. He just said once he started to ask, he just realized that people had these experiences. They didn't like talking about them. Maybe hippies did, but your straight ass square wouldn't talk about them because they'd be considered, there were social consequences for talking about these things. I mentioned this to a colleague once, and it was called the space cadet. So I stopped talking about it to my colleagues at that point. There's all sorts of reasons why. When you start to look at it and you start to dive into literature, you start to see, and I'm just looking at from my Spirit Wiki now, a list of connection experience types. So you can have birth experiences, this experience of birth or rebirth. Stanislav Grof talked a little bit about this, I think, where you experience rebirth. That's connection experience. You're connecting to higher levels of consciousness and experiencing transformative healing events. You have flow experiences or deep flow experiences where, if a musician is very, it has technical facility with the instrument, there can be connection. They can disconnect from their normal consciousness, and musical expertise. They can have these amazing performances that just transcend the the typical boundaries of musicality. You can have healing experiences. You can connect with consciousness and be instantly healed. The founder of AA, what's his name? I can't think of his name right now.
Bill.
Yeah, he had a mystical experiences that completely cured him of alcohol. You can have push experiences which push you in a direction and urge you forward. Maslow talked about plateau experiences. There's nadir experiences. Most people wouldn't consider really paranoid, dark, negative, fear-based experiences as mystical experiences, but they are, right? You can have these experiences in dreams, right? You can have connection experiences in dreams where you solve daily problems or have an enlightenment or whatever. You can have traditional enlightenment, nirvana style satori experiences, right? You can have minor, I even think, minor, insights that happen during the day when you're calm or when you're lying down in bed and thinking about something and ideas start popping into your mind. That these are also minor connection experiences. You're connecting to sources of wisdom and information beyond the body, right? So it's just, there's so many different ways that this is experienced and so many different outcomes that when you start to look at it, you go, yeah, I think, most people have had these. My kids have had them. They've had these experiences. I've had these experiences. People that I've talked to have had these experiences. Sometimes it's children, sometimes it's adolescents, sometimes during crisis, sometimes it's a result of connection supplements or crisis or whatever. It's just, I just believe it's such a common experience. And the fact that we don't really understand that is a real failure on the part of the scholarly establishment or even the mystical establishment to emphasize the fact that these are natural, common, essential human experiences, right? And if we're not having these experiences, then something's wrong. And Maslow actually said that. He said that the people who didn't have these experiences were repressed, damaged in some way, weren't able, forced them out, denied them.
Yeah, I'm really glad you clarified that, because in my personal anecdotal research, I realized at some point that most people have these experiences. And exactly what you're talking about, it's usually one-on-one, and sometimes the experiences are very dramatic and shocking, and they come from people that you would never expect. And they're always very skittish to talk about it, embarrassed. They'll say something very, again, I abducted by aliens, talking to God, stuff that is very dramatic, right? And but then they'll talk in great lengths and details about what happened to them, but there's a lot around it being like, oh, I must have been overtired. It must have been some sort of waking dream. I don't think I've never had mental illness before, but this must be some kind of blip. And even sometimes in spiritual atmospheres, environments, right? I think about the liberal mainline church, which I'm not knocking, I love, but if you after the service when you're eating your dry cookie, if you're making some small talk with someone and you started talking about having a one-on-one with Jesus, right? They back away from you, scared. So I see. So yes, I think that there is this great fear because we live in this secular society, even though, as you talked about, you don't have to be a person of faith. And as well, I suspect, look, I've done a few meditation retreats. If you go on a big meditation retreat of any style, any tradition, people there are going to have mystical experiences, no matter what their beliefs or their background. And at the end of the day, meditation is just sitting quietly, right? And you mentioned being in nature. I think in times past, people spent a lot of time in the dark by themselves. Candles were expensive, or they spent a lot of time in nature. Now, if I'm bored in the evening, I go on my laptop. If I'm going for a walk in nature, I'm listening to a podcast or I'm on my phone. I think about oh man, there's this study. It's something like 40. It's a very dramatic number. I'm going to make it too high. It's at least 40. It might be the majority. It might be 60% of people. If you put them in a completely dark room, completely dark, with a candle and a mirror, the majority of people will see a ghost or a dead loved one or something in the mirror. You just leave them alone long enough. So this capacity, this for having these connection experiences, I think is much, much, much more natural, built in, wired in, common than we know. And I think there's also something about modernity where we have them less, right?
Yeah.
Because I can occupy myself. I'm not alone in the mind. I don't have as many triggers. So I'm really glad that you sort of delved into that. And as you said, you're of course building on the previous work. But if people are spiritual people, you're curious, you're mystics, and you have some people in your life who are not and think that you're weird, get them one-on-one over a glass of wine. And and get you might be surprised about the story. Everybody has, I should say everybody, most people have a story. Sometimes there's more than one.
Yep. Well, you're speaking about being out in nature in the past. Indigenous societies have long had specific practices where they will send people out into the bush by themselves, specifically to have a connection experience. To connect with their ancestors or with their the animal spirits or whatever it is. So it's these Stanislav Grof called them technologies of the sacred. These things have been around for ages. They're everywhere. Every society has them, except maybe Western secularized society. Every society, every tradition from time immemorial, like way back in the days of the shamans, have had connection practices to facilitate and connect with these experiences. And I think there's a real argument to be made that we've lost a lot of that in our modern world, and that it wasn't very long ago. I have a quote by Vine Deloria where he said, Vine Deloria is this Indigenous scholar who started out atheist, but by the end of it was believing the old stories that, we used to be more connected. We used to have these, we used to live more in the spirit, and now we don't. And he lamented the fact that we lost that. And I do too. I think it's, a lot of our problems could be solved if people would slow down, make these connections and connect with these higher sources of, some might sound corny to some, wisdom and intelligence, and just integrate these into the bodily ego, right? Or into their system. They'd be a lot happier, live more purpose-filled lives as well, be a lot less easy to control.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you mentioned the emotional and psychological challenges of your first connection experiences, early connection experiences that people might have, including, fears afterwards of being overwhelmed, concerns about sanity. This is something that we see in the literature, or again, might know somebody who, oh, they saw God, they were abducted by aliens, they became one with everything, but it must have been a psychotic break because afterwards they seem to have fallen into a pit of mental illness. What grounding practices or boundary setting techniques did you find most crucial for navigating these intense phases? While still having a 9 to 5, while still living your life.
Yeah. So I limited the amount of time I'd spend in connection with these experiences. They were they were quite taxing in the beginning. It's like sitting in a room and listening to 10 people talk at you and trying to sort that all out. It's exhausting. So you have to limit your time. Um, Most people would, when they limit their time, would just not do it again because it can be so taxing. But like I said, in the beginning, I made a conscious decision to figure this out. Um, my academic training helped. I'm trained in sociology, and sociology is, when it comes to theory and handling ideas, is one of the more difficult disciplines to deal with. It's kind of like philosophy, but better, I would say. I'm sorry. I'm just kidding. We need philosophy. But it's of that nature. You're dealing with a lot of complex ideas and you're trying to sort it out. And so lots of practice reading that stuff, lots of practice, writing theory and sorting it out. So I had that training, which made me think I might be able to do it. And the biggest thing I think was I had technological props. I had a computer, which I could write stuff down and edit. And I also very early on in the process, I think maybe 2005, 2006. This all started in 2003, but as I started to kind of grasp the enormity of what it is that I was involved in, I said I need something, and so I installed. My prior life I had been into technology. I'd been with scholarly journals and scholarly communication. I'd done some software development and a bunch of things like that, and so I was technologically sophisticated. So I said, I need something. What can I do? So I took MediaWiki software, which is the software which runs um, Wikipedia. So I can use this. That's what I did. And so I started to put, every time I was in session or connection, I would start throwing concepts and ideas down in the Spirit Wiki. And I would do that, with great discipline. So every time I thought of a new idea, or every time I made a new connection, I would add that to the Spirit Wiki. And it kind of grew over the course of like 20 years. And I added additional software, like a semantic media wiki software, which allows you to do interlinking between concepts and to develop a structured information source. And this has really helped me keep my ground, keep things consistent. So, if I said something 10 years ago, it's still there, and I can go and I have to address that if my thinking has changed. It's always a reference point for me. I can go and I can store quotes that I find interesting there, and concepts that are connected with my work. And yeah, it's just been great. And most recently, I started to incorporate AI into the work, and I have an AI that I'm working with on building out the Spirit Wiki now. So
And is the Spirit Wiki public for people who would like to check it out?
yeah, it's completely open, and so it's basically the canonical repository. It's everything, mostly everything I've ever thought or written down about the concepts. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And then what's the address again?
it's spiritwiki.lightningpath.org.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, everybody definitely check that out if you're watching right now. You'll see it scrolling across your screen, and it will be in the show notes. So, okay, continuing on. I think actually I'll stay with Spirit Week for a sec, because I think that's just a resource that a lot of people out there are looking for, and it's a resource that a lot of people out there is looking for, and they had no idea that it existed. I bet you a lot of people are going to turn off their YouTube or their iPad or whatever they're listening to this on as a podcast, and they're going to go to spiritwiki.lightningpath.org, because I suspect that a lot of our audience, of course, this could be the first show for somebody, but all you returners, you're the kind of people who will spend all night on this site. It's kind of the audience I have. I think is very devoted. They're going to dive in, and I think they're going to get a lot out of it. Um, oh, go ahead.
No, I that makes
Oh, great, great. Okay, so your concept of consciousness as a fabric of consciousness, or a quote unquote cosmic internet, it's very compelling. How does this model help explain this variety of connection experiences that you've observed, and what are its implications for individual consciousness after we die?
okay. That's a tough question. It's a big question. Um,
An easy
and
question like what happens to you when you die, and what is consciousness? So two easy questions for you, Dr. Sosteric.
yeah, no problem. It's a Tuesday afternoon, no big deal. Okay, yeah. So you kind of have to understand what the fabric of consciousness is to understand how it explains mystical or connection experience. And so the way I conceive, the way it was explained to me, is that consciousness exists eternally as this fabric of awareness, um, and bliss. So these are the two fundamental components of this fabric. Within this fabric, over the course of the unfolding of consciousness, I would call it, um, points of self-awareness develop. It's like this, if it's an intensification of consciousness to the point of awareness, kind of like waking up in the morning. You're in your dream, you're not really self-aware, but then you wake up in the morning and you gradually go, oh, I'm awake. And this consciousness does that. These individual points of consciousness emerge. I call them monadic intensifications because they're singular intensifications of awareness and bliss. Um, they emerge in consciousness and proliferate it in a ridiculously, just cosmically the high level numbers. There's so many of them. Um, these points of consciousness represent your higher self, your Atman, your blazing star, whatever you want. I call it spiritual ego or monadic intensification if you want to be more technical. And it's these points. These points are not you. These are not you that I'm talking to now, right? Well, who I'm talking to now is the bodily ego. It's your bodily consciousness. And unless you're listening with a grounded connection, which may be the case, then mostly it's your bodily consciousness that's present. So a connection event is when bodily consciousness breaks through barriers and safeguards. I'm going to say safeguards because there are times when you really don't want to be fully connected. So say you're on the savannah and a lion is stalking. You want to be present in the grounded reality. You don't want to be lost in cosmic consciousness someplace. So these safeguards are subverted or broken through. Then you connect to that, and you can connect to aspects of the collective unconsciousness, I would say, which is where the fears and archetypes and ideology and indoctrinal blockages exist. And if you can get through all that crap, then you can connect to your own Atman, your spiritual ego, which is, I think, this is just pure speculation, but I think most of the time when people are connecting with God or some powerful consciousness, that's what they're connecting to. They're not connecting with God, with the wider fabric. They're connecting to their own selves, and they just don't really recognize how powerful that consciousness is. It really, it's the difference. In my writing, I'll describe it as a difference between candle and a full-on sun, right? Like that's the magnitude of difference. And so that can be overwhelming. And that can explain lots of different experiences. Like you can experience that depending on your pre-existing psychological or emotional conditions or damage. You can experience that as a loving entity, a wisdom power, or you can experience it as a terrifying, powerful soul that's out to get you if you've been indoctrinated into that Christian sort of mentality where that sort of thing exists. Don't think it does. Beyond that, individual Atman, then there's everybody else's Atman, everybody else's soul, going all the way back to the beginning of creation, because all that exists all right now. Our notions of linear time are imposed on us by the fact that we live in a physical universe, but outside of that universe, everything exists all at once, and just like that movie says, right? So you can experience any aspect of consciousness, any monad in any time period, for any reason, discussing any sort of information you want, experiencing any kind of a flow, and it's that incredible variety that explains the variety of mystical experiences that people can have. A lot of which probably a lot of people don't talk about because they can probably get a little strange for most people to deal with. But so I think it's this complicated fabric of consciousness that exists as the foundation of everything that explains. I don't know if I'm making any sense here.
Yeah, I think so. I think we got it all figured out. So put a pin in those two questions. What happens to us after we die, and the meaning and nature of consciousness. So everybody, I'll clip this portion. We'll put it on TikTok. We'll get a lot of action. I can feel it. A question that I really want to get to is, what is one common misconception about mysticism that you encounter most frequently, and how do you address it?
Okay, let me find my notes here. Right. So what's the biggest? So I think the biggest misconception is that mystical experiences are one-off events, and I think we've discussed this a little bit. Discrete enlightenments after which you return to normal, or normal plus plus, slightly enhanced, maybe with a renewed sense of purpose or realization that there's more to life than your daily Starbucks latte, whatever, and that's it. And so many people I've talked to over the years, they hold up this singular mystical experience or two, and it is this life-defining event for them, and they move on from that, and they never have another one because they've had their thing. And I just don't think that that's not the way it should work, and it is a big misconception because this is a temporary connection experience, but the real goal of human existence is to live with persistent and consistent connection. So we're more connected than we normally are. We're generally connected throughout the day, and we exist with this informational, this connection to the fabric, right? Beyond, and it's got to be a pure connection. It's got to be free of all the detritus and flotsam and all the other stuff that gets stuck in there. But yeah, so that's the misconception that this is, you've had an experience in your enlightenment. And one of my biggest pet peeves is authors who will have an mystical experience or two, and I ain't gonna name names, and then make a fucking career out of it,
Yeah.
and they don't really know what they're talking about, but they can convince everybody that they do because they have this mystical sounding knowledge, which they wrap in mystical sounding words, and everybody who's never been into that forest goes, cool, you're my guru, pay me, I'll pay you, right? I think I have an allegory, the allegory of the blindfold. I think I discussed this a little bit in that one, where people have these experiences, and then they end it there, and they tell everybody else that it ends there, and then they profit off of that. And it's not right. It's we are capable of so much more, and the end product of human development, if you live a lifetime of connection, is a lot different than if you live a lifetime of disconnection, spending your time coffees at Starbucks and, always listening to music and always connected to a screen. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the phenomenon that you're talking about has been made worse by the internet, right? There's some very big names out there, people who are millionaires, who are on Oprah, and maybe have tons of books that meet the description of the kind of person you're talking about, but maybe on a smaller scale that can still be pretty big. There's people making some serious bucks out there, right? Through the internet, kind of setting up online communities, courses, what have you. Now, I'm not saying this is inherently bad, but it's I think part of the phenomenon that you're talking about, where people, genuinely perhaps do have something to share. They did actually have an experience that gave them some insight that other people can benefit from, but it hasn't made them perfect enlightened gurus that, maybe they have one piece that they should be sharing with people, maybe not for money, but they're not really at the level of shepherding people through these experiences towards a life of connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you ask, how do I deal with that? So I try and I'm trying to build an educational system, like I've started to call it a human development framework. Actually, my AI companions developed this talk. I think it was the AI. It's really interesting, my experiences with AI. The AI is actually coining terms and helping theoretical development. You really did not expect that. It's quite the experience. But anyway, to develop a system that kind of makes these points and shows people connection practices and says, this is the direction you should be going. I'm not interested in having followers. I'm just interested in pointing. Go that way. I've been here. Go that way. Um, and but that takes a lot of work. That comes after 22 years of daily work. Like I kid you not, I have put every day except Christmas, and sometimes on Christmas, work into this. I'm either in a connected state or writing or revising, adding stuff to the Spirit Wiki, making connections, reading. It's not something that you just walk into after a single experience or two or three or even five. It's a lifelong thing.
Yeah. You link connection experience to a neurological phenomenon, while arguing consciousness is more than a neurological epiphenomenon. So, how do you reconcile like the neurological mechanisms with the transphysical nature of consciousness, with the transpersonal nature of consciousness that you propose?
It's a great question, and it's one of the questions that people stick on, right?
Yeah.
Well, you can see this impact on the brain. How can it be, outside of the body? So I think of it like it's not the best metaphor, I don't think, but it kind of points in the right direction. The brain's like a prism. It's a focuser, it's a refractor, a portal through which consciousness enters into physical creation. And I think there's visuals of that in the mystical literature, in Freemasonry and Gnosticism. I know I've seen stuff like that. Alex Gray, I think, has that kind of perspective. Prism, your brain, in the neurology, it's inert unless you shine a beam of light through it, consciousness, right? But when you do, the prism refracts that light into physical existence. It bends it and shapes it and presents it. And so for me, the sophisticated neurological components of the body are the essential mechanisms that are required to refract the your monadic intensification, your spiritual ego, into consciousness or into reality, right? It's like without the animating spark of consciousness, the neurology doesn't function, right? You're dead. But you can't get consciousness into physical reality without this sophisticated focusing device. It's necessary for consciousness to work from the inside out, I guess you could say. I mean, consciousness is all around us and working all the time, but coming through a physical body with hands and fingers and a thumb, which can do all sorts of amazing things with creation, requires consciousness to enter through that prism or portal. And so that's what the function of the neurology is. So that's just theory at this point. I imagine we need to do some work on proving that. But
Yeah. So you've developed tools to measure and characterize connection experiences. Can you tell us about them and what practical applications you do envision for these tools, these scales in therapeutic settings in advancing the scientific study of mysticism and connection experiences?
yeah, so I've worked on a couple. I've developed some scales to measure damage from childhood, because I think one of the blockages that stops people from making connections is trauma from childhood. So I've got some stuff on that, but I've also developed scales to kind of wrap around mystical experience, and they basically revolve around these connection axes, I call it. There's 5 qualitative and quantitative measures of connection that you can record, and so these include the connection content, which is the actual content of the connection. So is it a vision of unity? Did you have a conversation with God? Was there this massive informational dump? Did you use a Ouija board and get like the Ouija board poet? I don't know if there's this really famous Nobel laureate poet that used Ouija board for his poetry.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll dig it out for you afterwards. I was quite fascinated when I came across. Oh, cool. You can look at the content, you can look at the duration. How long did you experience this experience of something more? The intensity was a big one. On a scale of 1 to 10, how intense was it? And for me, if somebody's asking me, did I have a mystical experience? My question to them is, well, did you feel like you stepped outside your normal daily consciousness? Was there something more happening? Did you? And if they say yes, then okay. How intense was that? Was it one? Was it a little minor nature experience that I feel really good about myself and the world and conscious and creation for a little bit? Or was this mind-searing visionary experience of the unfolding of creation? 10, someplace in between. The outcome of that experience? Was it positive? Did you walk away from that happy and emancipated and walking in the clouds kind of thing, or was it a fearful negative event? Um, and then not necessarily was it fearful, but did you have a negative outcome? So did you become paranoid or fearful? Did you descend into mental health issues, that sort of thing? Because that can happen. So was the outcome positive or was it negative? What was the quality of the experience? Was it a positive experience or was it a negative experience, or was it both? Sometimes people will have both. You can have these awesome experiences, but they're tinged with various levels of fear, paranoia, confusion, whatever, as you struggle internally with whatever downloads are happening. So, and yeah, I think that's 5, right? Content, intensity, outcome, quality. I think I might be missing one. Duration, intensity, outcome, yeah, and quality. No, that's right. So yeah, so those scales, I think that's important because I hate to tap my own shoulder, but most of the scales that I've seen try to measure mystical experience are really quite confused. They just throw a whole bunch of stuff onto the page and say, well, if you had some of these things, you've had a mystical experience, but it doesn't really add anything analytically, right? So this scale, particularly thinking of these things along these connection axes, I think it adds a lot of analytical sophistication to our understanding. So you could actually, well, if you had a mystical experience, I can ask you, what was the content? Like, what did you think? How intense was it? What was the outcome? Did it help you in any way? What was the quality? It gives you the ability to talk about these things in therapy and also analyze them if you're going to start doing a study, collecting these axes, analyzing the variety of mystical experiences. And I think there's a lot of benefit scientifically because this sort of scaling allows you to more easily see the variety of mystical experience, like William James would say, right? That there's an incredible variety, and how do we understand? How do we catalog? How do we make sense of it all? So that's what I think.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we're starting to get to time. We got almost halfway through the question sheet, but as we're talking about, you'll definitely have to come back. But sort of keeping keeping on topic. But I want to skip ahead to the last question, which is, you mentioned quote unquote connection pathologies and quote unquote connection psychosis as potential negative outcomes. So we did talk about how, like, in your personal experience, and how I've talked about before on the show, that the mystical experiences, connection experiences, can have this terrifying aspect to them, but we didn't talk about afterwards possible potential negative outcomes. What are the key warning signs, and how can one differentiate between the challenging but transformative experiences and, like, actual genuine pathological states? The doctor Sosteric, this is something I think a lot about, right? Because I sometimes have trouble when I read or hear about schizophrenia and similar disorders, and mystics and esotericists and magicians and people who talk to entities and have wonderful mystical experiences. So yeah, so definitely a question that is something that I devote a lot of time to and don't have very many answers or speculations.
It's a big question. So it's hard to discuss in the last few minutes of the show. But I think, the quick answer is that the warning signs, susceptibility comes from people with ego damage. So people who have self-esteem issues, who have low self-esteem, who have, experienced a lot of abuse growing up, who maybe aren't certain of themselves, who have experienced heavy duty indoctrination in the church or science. Because a scientist making a connection experience to God can find that quite traumatizing. Like, I'm going crazy. I've lost my mind, right? So, it's this ego damage that can kind of make you susceptible, and you're looking for it in identifying connection pathologies. You're looking for those. I think you're looking for signs of ego damage. So guritis, somebody makes these connections, and all of a sudden they're this really super wise guru that can save the planet. I've seen that happen a couple times. There's a bunch of different ones. I think I list them on the website. Ego inflation. You don't have to become a guru, but you suddenly you're more important than maybe you maybe you could claim, right? You can have flooding, a pathology where you just cannot stop the flow, where it just gushes and gushes and gushes and overwhelms until you literally have to do something to stop it. Take a pharmaceutical, or go to bed, or take active action. And I think so. That's a big area that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. I plan to eventually, but so those are the connection pathologies, and I think they basically come down to to damaged and distorted ego structures, bodily ego structures. As connection psychosis, it's more serious. I mean, that happens when the ego is basically destroyed. Like it as a functioning entity, it doesn't exist. And if it does exist, it has permeable boundaries. It's filled with misconception and trauma. And it when it makes these connections, it has no way to shut them down or control them. And this is where you get some forms of schizophrenia, where the people they just cannot shut that connection down. And they're not in a position where it should be open permanently, because there's too much damage and too much misconception, and all of that powerful connection is getting filtered through that damage, and that comes out as psychosis. I'm not saying that all schizophrenia, all psychosis is a spiritual connection psychosis, but I guess that some of it is, you know.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so we the unfortunately, and there's a big unfortunate because there's so much more I wanted to talk to you about, but we do have to wrap up. I got through the entire interview without calling you accidentally Doctor So Esoteric. I'm very proud of myself. Can you tell people more about where to find you, what to read, things that you've done? Maybe somebody out there needs some extra course credit and they can take something from you online.
Yeah.
Give us the commercials.
Well, I'm just doing a website that kind of lays it all out. So I'll send that to you afterwards. It's just it's a GitHub, but you can find me on the Lightning Path, www.lightningpath.org, Spirit Wiki, which is already mentioned. I have a page out, academia.edu, and I'm on Twitter, but I'm really I cuss a lot and I swear, and I use that to express my anger with the situation in the world. So I'm not sure you want to see that side of me. If you find me, great. I ain't going to tell you where it is though. So yeah, but I'll send you the webpage which I'm developing, which is eventually will list all everything I've written in kind of a sensible, chronological, analytically complete. It's
Great.
sensible anyway, right?
Yeah, watch for that, people, because if it's not out yet or not ready, we'll put it out on our socials, edit it in later, what have you, so people will be able to find that. Finally, you can help us keep doing the show by going to patreon.com/Gnostic or paypal.me/Gnostic and donate whatever you're able to, or don't. It's all cool. If you like the show, you want to help us out, you don't have any money, which is fine. I don't have any. Tell people about the show. Take this episode, send it to someone that you know who would enjoy it, which is probably everybody that you know. So, Dr. Sosteric, thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully, we'll talk again soon. And thank you.
It was
Bye,
great.
everybody.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.